Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours, the travel company led by reporters from around the world. And my name's Owen Bennett-Jones. I'm sitting in today for Nicholas Wood, and we're discussing the Middle East with Charlie Gammell, an historian, former diplomat. He was on the Iran desk at the Foreign Office. He had a diplomatic posting in Morocco, and we'll be talking about Morocco towards the end, ahead of a tour to Morocco next year. So, Charlie Gammell, welcome to you.
Owen, great to be with you.
And we've all witnessed this incredible week in the Middle East. I guess three parties to the conflict: the US, Israel, and Iran. All the podcasts I listen to say Israel came out on top. Do you agree?
Well, I think in today's day and age, what victory looks like is quite difficult to define. If we sort of transpose that over to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, just by Russia surviving, it looks like they may be able to, in other words, achieve a victory. I think that there is a big danger that the expected flooding of the streets of anti-regime protesters and the kind of significant weakening of the Islamic Republic hasn't happened, despite the fact that it's been hit very hard. 19 out of 25 of its senior intelligence and military officials were killed, and there's been an earthquake at the top of the Islamic Republic. However, that hasn't been a fatal earthquake. And speaking to people in Iran, in sort of government, and then on your sort of in the streets, as it were, the government now is in a position where it wants to crack down on dissent. And it sees this very dangerous point where its policies could start to unravel, where there's a reckoning, where people start to say, was this nuclear gamble worth it? Was all this money spent on Iraq and Isfahan and all these places worth it when it's just brought misery on us? However, people in Iran are terrified of going out onto the streets now because they know that they will be met with savage reprisals. They've already started the executions. They've arrested nearly 1,000 people. There are besiege barricades and checkpoints in big parts of big cities waiting for the tiniest sniff of resistance and seeking to crack down on it. So I think that the Islamic Republic, simply by surviving, is in a potentially good position. What is sort of a follow-on from that point, what is potentially nerve-inducing, is that European and American partners now are saying maybe now's the time to negotiate with the Iranians, negotiate on their nuclear program. Now, that is an implicit acknowledgement that it wasn't destroyed, which is something to be aware of. But secondly, if that negotiation leads to sanctions relief for the Islamic Republic, and the Islamic Republic, similar, sort of in parallel, clamp down on IEA inspectors and start enriching uranium towards a bomb, the Islamic Republic is absolutely strengthened. It will be getting more money, that it can start arming its proxies again, and it will be able to clamp down more on its protesters in the streets.
So just to be clear, you've no doubt that they will continue with the nuclear weapons program.
Yeah, the motivation for Iran to have a bomb is a threat perception, how they see the region, and they see the region. They see themselves as vulnerable in the region from American military bases, but also they see themselves as the regional hegemon, as they did under the Shah. It's the same doctrine. We want to be the regional hegemon. So that threat perception plus that sort of natural Iranian sense of itself in the region, those two things now are still there. In fact, the threat perception is even more. So the impetus to get a bomb remains and perhaps has been amplified.
So we had Trump saying obliterated.
Yep.
We had Vance, I think the latest I heard was saying seriously set back.
Yep.
Your assessment?
My assessment is that it wasn't as successful as it was. And when you have Pete Hegseth saying that they have intelligence sources suggesting that it was much worse, that it's been set back and it's been obliterated. You know, as someone who's sort of worked adjacent to that world, what does that look like? The Americans will not have human sources who can sort of go down into Natanz and Fordo and start taking pictures and sending them back live time to the Pentagon. That's just not possible. So what they're basing that on is not true. It might be signals intelligence, perhaps, but again, that in-depth, granular understanding is something that I don't think America would have, and potentially those first assessments that it was damaged but not completely obliterated. That's probably where I'd go.
Right. Now, then you talk about sources inside Iran, and it's clear that the Israelis had an astonishing degree of access to information in Iran, including where all these people lived, what jobs they did. I mean, had seriously penetrated the Iranian system, which is an astonishing achievement. But it occurs to me that this enriched uranium that everyone says left the site and was hidden is still hidden. So there is still some element of the regime that is secure and is not compromised.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's still, as you say, there's still a core of the regime to it who are loyal to, or the state apparatus that are loyal to that very secretive aim of getting a bomb. I think the Israeli penetration of sort of Iranian and Iranian military and intelligence circles was pretty all-encompassing and a massive achievement that they've been working on for the last 15 years. And it's a huge tactical achievement. I think what's lacking, as is often the case with Israel, is that they are tactical masters, but they can overlook the strategic objectives.
Right. Let's just talk a bit about that, because looking at Israel's policy, Gaza, and previously Iraq, Libya, Lebanon, to the extent they're involved in these places, is to weaken their enemies and to keep everyone around them in a state of weakness and turmoil. They've sort of not quite managed that in Iran because the regime is still there. But is that strategic policy sustainable? I mean, do you see it as a long-term solution for Israel to keep everyone around them weak?
Yeah, and the question that's hovered over the sort of Israeli involvement in the region since October the 8th has been, what's the end state here? What's the desired end state for Israel? So that has been something that, potentially that's born of the way Israel sees a threat and actually sees this is sort of the crocodile nearest the boat, and we have to have tactical solutions to these problems. Potentially there's an over-reliance on American strategic sort of reach into the region, and actually an assumption that we do the tactics, you guys do the strategy, given that we're both aligned. I think that focus on the end state, particularly with Gaza, and particularly, we would have seen it, we saw it in Afghanistan, we saw it in Iraq. We've seen it with our own counterterrorism efforts since 9/11, that there is a world where killing civilians and killing people who are associated with these groups, it just creates more people, it creates more loyalty to Hamas, it creates more loyalty to, Hezbollah might be slightly different, but the Hamas 3.0, Al-Qaeda 3.0, all of these groups, they're sort of second generation that is born of increased violence and, I suppose, conflict. They are usually more hardcore. We saw it with ISIS, we saw it with Al-Qaeda bleeding into ISIS, and we've seen it in so many different theaters. That's the challenge that's the strategic challenge that Israel is going to have to face.
I mean, it's difficult to confirm this, but I read one account that Hamas has more members now than it did in October the 7th. That they've replaced every single person they've lost. I mean, that is an incredible thought.
And there's a great book, and again, this is not the Hamas context. There's a great book about Afghanistan that came out recently called The Afghans by a Norwegian journalist. And one of the things it focused on was the role that female Afghan relatives of the Taliban played in supporting the insurgency against Western troops. And we just never even thought of that. And actually the role they played in giving safe houses, in basically doing operational activity and supporting the insurgency. The insurgency in Afghanistan grew in direct correlation to the fighting that we were doing against it. And if you look at Al-Qaeda in 2003, it was to a degree a busted flush. The ideology of Al-Qaeda had taken a massive hit at the unpopularity that a lot of people across the world saw about the 9/11 attack. So yes, you could create another generation of fighters by doing what they're doing. And however, that's not to say that Israel shouldn't do what it is doing, because it is facing a massive threat from all the sides. But Israel's just going to have to catch up. He's going to be having to catch up with the threats as it evolves.
Right, and relying on US support to do that. I mean, this is really a question for someone who follows American politics, but I mean, you may have a take on it. We've just had this Democratic mayor primary winner in New York who is talking about a global intifada. You've got polls in the US that clearly show a shift in opinion against Israel. And I just wonder for how long the Israeli-US relationship will remain quite as solid as it is now. Do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, and I think that you look at Trump's visit to the Middle East, his GCC visit, his sort of roadshow with all the airplanes and the gold taps. A big feature of that was the fact that he didn't go and see Israel. You look at the American-Iranian relationship at them, or not prior strikes. They were talking to each other, in the teeth of massive Israeli resistance. And I think domestically we have it here in the UK. One of the problems that Keir Starmer has is how does he play to his Islamic base? How does he have a policy that is aligned with Israel, which fits certain strategic objectives that we have in the region on counterterrorism, on countering Iran, and yet at the same time not alienate his domestic base? So, this is a problem that is at the top of politics, but it's also at the sort of constituent end. And I think if we talk about Trump, one of the concerns was that when he went to the Gulf, he looked at these Gulf partners and he was astounded by the wealth. And that's what he saw. And he thought, you know what, these guys can give us something. These guys can give us money. They can invest. They can invest in Jared's, massive $5 billion fund. They can make me richer. What does Israel give us? And I think that is a question that he's had. We don't get anything from Israel. It's just money. It's just a sort of a bottomless pit into which we pour resources. And particularly given that Trump doesn't have a coherent strategic worldview, it's just money. And if you put what Israel's doing in there, which feels quite anachronistic now because it's against Islamism and it's against all this kind of stuff, you start to wonder at what point will Trump run out of road. And an evidence of that was his rapprochement with the Syrian leader, which again would be unthinkable in a sort of an ideologically or a strategic driven foreign policy, whereas Trump really isn't thinking strategically. He's not thinking ideologically. He's just thinking about money. And maybe the Iran strike was the last knockings of some kind of US-Israeli alliance. That's a bit dramatic, but I do think you're right.
Okay, well, and then if you go from there, and we're getting very speculative and way into the future now, but if you were, you used to work in the British Foreign Ministry, Foreign Office, if you were working the Israeli equivalent, would you be thinking, you know what, looking ahead 20, 30 years, my important relationship may be not just with Washington, but also with Beijing? And do they have an emerging China policy? Are they worried about that? Are they thinking about that? How to create some kind of relationship with China?
I think the challenge that Israel's got at the moment is bandwidth, and they are so taken up with the conflict, and they are so taken up with the domestic ramifications of the conflict. And I'm not just talking about the logistics of fighting a war on many fronts, but brain drain. Their economy's been absolutely whacked. There are to go back to a theme, there are very kind of short-term tactical issues that they have to start dealing with. I would say in order to mitigate or hedge against that US threat, they really should be looking at actually sorting out what's going on in the Middle East, because if they don't sort out what's going on in the Middle East, if they don't come to some kind of rapprochement with the Saudis over Gaza, that will be a sort of a long-standing, baked-in vulnerability to Israel. And I remember 3 weeks before October the 7th, I was doing a podcast with someone and we were talking about the Middle East, and they were saying, look, it seems like everything's kind of fine. You've got the Israelis and the Saudis potentially normalizing relations. The Israelis and the Iranians have kind of come together. There was that Chinese mediation. It looks like things are okay. And I sort of said, it feels like that. However, the sort of central wound that drives a lot of the stuff in the Middle East is West Bank, it is Gaza. And as long as that's not solved, all of this other stuff around the edge remains massively vulnerable.
Well, let's talk about that then. And, you can make the argument that some in the Israeli system, in the cabinet, want to depopulate Gaza at the most extreme end of it. And others don't. From the Saudi point of view, MBS has been clear that Palestinian issues matter to him. And he has weakened his position from there must be a two-state solution to there must be a route to a two-state solution to where we are now, which is probably even vaguer. Would it be unfair for the Israelis to conclude eventually MBS will just cut the Palestinians off, even if there was mass population transfer, just accept it, and go for normalization? In other words, can they sit it out and get what they want, the Israelis, on normalization with Saudi Arabia?
That's definitely Israel's strategy. And again, that's why expanding the conflict into Iran has been a strategic good thing for Israel because it's playing to some of Saudi Arabia's very sort of long-held fears about the Islamic Republic. But we can sort of get into that dynamic a little bit later. Yeah, that's what Israel wants. Israel wants Saudi Arabia effectively to get bored. Now, I think that that is an underestimation of the depth of feeling within Saudi about the Palestinian issue. You know, a lot of prominent Saudi families look to fund Palestinian causes from a humanitarian as much as a political or an Islamist perspective. And I think that is an underestimation of the degree to which MBS is concerned about his domestic audience. And we have to remember that within Saudi Arabia, you know, MBS sees things through a regional perspective, but he also sees things through a local perspective. And his big kind of very admirable transformation project that he's undertaking in Saudi Arabia rests upon the domestic population being content. And I think it also rests upon some kind of grudging buy-in from the conservative Islamic elites. And a big sort of red line for them is we have to sort out this issue of Palestine. And it would be that's why I think his position has been so altered, because you know he's saying I can't normalize ties with Israel whilst this is going on. And that feels to me, in speaking to sort of prominent Saudis, that still is the issue. And I don't think that Israel, hoping that Saudi will sort of one day get bored of the issue, I just don't think that will come to pass.
It's very interesting what you're saying there, because MBS is all powerful, right? I mean, he's one of the most powerful leaders in the world, and because he's got a big, rich country, but also because internally he's incredibly strong, and his word is law and so on. But this is probably the biggest constraint on him, isn't it? That he has to think about clerical and popular opinion on the Palestinians, and that does limit his freedom of movement. I should say that if people want to ask a question, as normal, raise that digital hand or just put it in the Q&A box, which Harold has done, and I will read out his question. Trump may not have the attachment to Israel that Biden did, but surely it remains a fundamental fact that you can hardly get elected to the Congress without either AIPAC or evangelical support. So, you know, that basically the US interest in Israel will be sustained for that domestic political reason.
Yeah, I mean, I think it will undoubtedly, and I don't think I'm sort of calling time on the or anyone is calling time on that relationship. I'm saying that, you know, previously that was a sort of unchallenged tenet of domestic American politics. It was an assumption. It was kind of this is what the reality is. But now, demography and the war in Gaza is starting to challenge that, and it's causing politicians. You saw it in Kamala Harris's slight inability to work out which way is which. We've seen it in the UK with Keir Starmer. It will become a feature, and I think it will become a almost like a rival internal lobby to American decision making.
Yeah, it seems to me it's more like a 10, 20-year thing, or even 20, 30-year thing before this really feeds through into opinion affecting politics. But yeah, it's coming, right?
And you saw it in the UK with Green candidates. I mean, there was some pretty unwholesome videos of Green candidates basically masquerading as Green candidates, but actually being quite hardcore Islamists, using that left-wing platform to hijack to start delivering some pretty unpleasant Islamist messages. So it's a coming issue. It's a coming challenge to Israel's domestic domination of American politics. And perhaps this is why, and some people have been saying, Israel's desire to get the Iran thing done is linked to that acknowledgement that long term we might not be able to influence the next two White Houses. We have to get all our strategic objectives done. And if you look at it from the Israeli perspective, Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian IRGC commander, a couple of months before he died, set out a list of things that make Iran safe. And they were Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthis, Syria, all of these things. And you can look at that list and go, well, Israel's pretty much dismantled all of those. The last one they haven't got is the Islamic Republic and potentially the Houthis. But I think they think if the Islamic Republic go, then maybe the Houthis won't be such a problem. So Israel is really thinking about regime change and really thinking that if we can get rid of the Islamic Republic, then everything will be different, which is, and obviously there's a lot of nuance in there, and it's an admirable goal, but it's where the devil meets the detail is where it gets a little bit more complex and potentially more messy.
Would you expect more strikes on Iran as more information comes out about the extent to which the nuclear program is still intact?
So the ceasefire, the challenge with the ceasefire now is that the Iranians are not, I don't think, they are not going to break it. It's not in their interest to break the ceasefire. It's in their interest to play nice and then get to a negotiation and do what they always do, which is pull the wool over diplomats' eyes, get a negotiated settlement or get some kind of sanctions relief, which means that in parallel they can continue their destabilizing activities at home and abroad. So in that respect, I don't think if there is a break in the ceasefire, it will be Iran who's done it. I think Mossad will absolutely continue to try and do operations on Iranian soil, as they've done, to try and set back Iran's nuclear program and to try and destabilize them internally. But I think that there won't be any short-term American strikes on it but having said that, if I look at it, the things that drive America's strikes and Israel's strikes are still in existence. This is a dangerous, destabilizing regime that wants a nuclear weapon. They haven't gone away, and they won't go away even if America negotiates a solution with Iran.
Well, it's more than that as well, isn't it? Because the Iranian response to these strikes was very, very weak. You know, it was astonishing to me that they didn't have more that they could do. I can't believe they were holding back. Do you think they were holding back?
This has been a feature of Iran's response to this, and this goes back to the 19th century. I wrote a book on the history which touched a lot on the Great Game, and when the Iranians were besieging Herat in 1830 something, what got them to sort of bring down that siege was a British use of force. They took some steamboats and they started bombing Iranian port cities, and that was the thing that made the Iranians pull back from the brink. And it's exactly the same here. The Islamic Republic is incredibly good at negotiations, and it's very weak when someone exerts serious force at it directly. We saw that with Soleimani. The words that the Islamic Republic used after Soleimani were killed were very fire and fury. The reality was very, very different to that. And this is Israel's. So just last point, Owen. Israel looked at Iran's response to the American strikes and have been saying to the White House, they're weak. This is the only language they speak is the language of force. And I think I agree with that.
Yeah, but after Soleimani, that's the Revolutionary Guard commander who was killed in Baghdad airport, wasn't it, under Trump 1. When there was a weak response to that, I thought, well, yes, okay, they don't want to do it now. You know, they're still trying to get a bomb. They're biding their time. It makes sense to sort of talk tough, but not actually do much. But after this, when their nuclear program was actually bombed, I thought, right, well, they will now want to respond in a very big way. And they basically couldn't. So it is backing up what you're saying.
Yeah, and a big part of that is because they know that Trump wants to negotiate a settlement here. They know that Europe wants to negotiate a settlement here. They don't want to jeopardize that, because a chance for a negotiation is another chance for them to have this two-track policy, which is we will negotiate, which will buy us time, and it could get us money through sanctions relief, and then we will continue to try and assassinate people in Europe and continue doing what we're doing.
I've got a question here from Tom. Possibly too niche, he says. I don't think it's niche. I just don't know how much you know about it, but you did say it. I'd like more detail on the claim that Islamists infiltrated the Green Party and made unpleasant statements.
So I'm going on videos of some Green Party activists, and again, this is from last year's election, so it's kind of slightly hazy in my mind, but where they were linking their policy to what's going on in Gaza and implicit support for Hamas's actions in Gaza. And there was a pretty clear line between their sort of left-wing, their sort of hijacking of a left-wing platform, which is the Green Movement, potentially, if you see it that way, and also their support for Hamas and their sort of strident opposition to what Israel's doing there.
Okay, just to encourage you, if you'd like to ask anything, this is a good time to do it. We are going to talk in a few moments about Morocco and the forthcoming Legal Tours trip to Morocco, but just on this general discussion of what's going on in the Middle East after these amazing strikes in Iran, we are very much open to questions. Let me just, while we're waiting for those to come in, ask you, what is your interpretation of American intentions towards Gaza? And actually, just picking up on one point you made in the chat we had just a couple of minutes before we came on live in this podcast, in this stream, you were saying that the Israeli operation in Iran shows that targeted bombing is something they can do if they want to. It was a very interesting point. I hadn't really thought of that, because they don't have a large civilian casualty list in Iran. There are some, I think, but most of it was very tightly targeted, suggesting that the policy of not targeting so tightly in Gaza is deliberate.
Yeah, I think Israel has been consistent when it's been operating on Iranian soil that it's tried to portray itself as a friend of Iran, and there are
Mm.
pretty good diaspora links between Iran and Israel. There's not a lot of support in Iran for Hamas. There's not a lot of support in Iran for fundamentalist Islamist groups, and they've been really careful. Everything they do in Iran is calculated to achieve kind of maximum impact on their target, but to minimize civilian casualties. So when they kill nuclear scientists, it's a bomb on the side of a car. It's not a bomb on a building, which basically kills everyone in it. So it's not necessarily that it's I'm saying that they are doing deliberately in Gaza. It's that perhaps in Iran they are much more conscious of the optics there. And I think in Gaza they don't really have a regime change narrative in Gaza. It's just a destroy narrative. Whereas in Iran, the operation is called Rising Lion, which is a direct reference to the Pahlavi flag. Netanyahu came out right afterwards and sort of tried to exhort the Iranian people to rise up. He's done that a lot. And that just goes to this long-standing desire for Netanyahu to achieve regime change in Iran, and I think that's just echoed. You see Trump echoing it, and actually the relationship between the Reza Pahlavi, who's the son of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, and Israel is quite a close one.
Is that right? Is that right?
You have the Israelis saying to Reza Pahlavi, "Look, come on, now is the time for you to come out
Mm,
and
mm,
start telling the Iranian people to go on the streets." But
mm.
again, that speaks to something that you and I were saying at the start, where we said that there's a fundamental misunderstanding on Israel's part of what Iranian people are thinking to a degree, because a lot of Iranians I've been speaking to have been saying, "Yeah, there's no way I'm going to march in the streets at
Mm, mm.
Netanyahu's behest. There's no way I'm going to march in the streets at Reza Pahlavi's behest because I will just be seen as a fifth columnist, and within 24 hours, I'll be shot."
Just one quick comment from me on some civilian casualties. It was very striking to me that I mean, it's a slightly tangential point, but when the Americans came under huge pressure politically in northwest Pakistan to stop killing so many civilians with their drones, uh, they did it. And they were able to reduce the number of civilian casualties to virtually zero, uh, despite the obvious difficulties of doing that. So it does suggest to me that governments can when they need to. We've got questions here coming in. Marty, is Iran's goal in having a bomb similar to North Korea's as a protection against attack versus actually using it? And sort of similar question for me. Would it be an effective deterrent against instability in the Middle East if they had one?
So I think it would be a deterrence against Iran getting attacked, and it would basically give them an umbrella under which to continue destabilizing the region and building up its proxies. The way in which it probably wouldn't be a deterrence to stability in the region is that you'd have lots of other regional powers wanting to get a bomb, and I think it could intensify the rivalry and it could set back some of this normalization that we've seen. And Israel's desire for Iran not to have a bomb is a good one, and I don't think an actor like Iran, that is undoubtedly a rogue actor that is doing some horrendous things, not just to its own people, but in the region, it shouldn't have a bomb. I mean, it's a pretty clear, that's a pretty clear statement, and I do agree with that. But it would be an umbrella under which they can continue to destabilize. And we've seen before that they want to employ more proxies. They want to work with gun runners. They want to work with criminals. They want to work with assassins in Europe. They are not a good actor, no matter what their diplomats say.
Two questions which are sort of related, so I'll ask you both at the same time. Tom, I'd be interested in more detail on Israel's economic woes and brain drain. How sustainable is Israel? And Diane, how does Israel see its future medium term now that the Western consensus is realigning and its limited population?
Yeah, the question on the economics, I'm probably not sort of particularly well placed to answer that. But speaking to in some of the conversation I have with people who are better placed to answer that than me, there is a medium term risk that Israel's economy will continue to decline. It's spending a lot on a war. It's not getting a lot of revenue from tourism. A lot of people are leaving. That is only sustainable for so long, and that feeds into some of their strategy. That's why they want to end the war in Iran as they see it. But I think there is an end state there which is potentially not good for Israel. Their medium-term strategy, that's been the question that's hovered over this conflict from day one. How does this end? How does this end? What is a post-conflict Gaza? And to me, a post-conflict Gaza is one that is absolutely riddled with Islamist fundamentalists who've seen their parents killed. And it's just a complete, and I worked in Afghanistan with the Red Cross in prisons and spent a lot of time in that country. And, we did lots of, the US and lots of governments did lots of research into why do people fight for the Taliban. People fought for the Taliban because their relatives were killed by the Americans. Whether they were Taliban or not, it doesn't matter. And that was the driver. That is the driver of recruitment. And the best recruiting sergeant for Hamas is indiscriminate civilian casualties. So I don't know. And I don't know how Israel stays ahead of that creeping Islamism. And then again, that's you take that out one. How does the world stay ahead of that creeping Islamism? And we've seen it on campuses throughout the Western world, where you have young people who are rightly align themselves with Gaza's civilians, but they're getting swept up in this Islamist narrative. And this is why Iran is having such great luck with young students in Europe and America saying, hey, we are the only people who are pushing back against Israeli aggression in the region. So it's not just a medium-term problem for Israel. I think it's a kind of a pretty big problem for the West in terms of what do our young people think about Islamism? What do our young people think about, for example, Iran? A lot of young people think actually Iran is doing the right thing. It's pushing back against Israeli aggression. And this is a real challenge, I think, for decision makers, particularly in the West, that have large Islamic populations as part of their overall population.
Okay, let's talk a bit about Morocco. You work there, and you're scheduled to run a tour there in, I think, February. Interesting place. Tell us, first of all, why it's an interesting place, and then we'll get into a bit more detail.
Well, I think Morocco, I mean, aside from it being a wonderful, wonderful country that is hospitable and beautiful and has mountains and deserts and oceans and everything you could possibly wish for, it's got a fascinating culture that's a mix of, French colonial, Berber, Arabic, Islam, lots and lots of different sort of impetuses that feed into the Moroccan cultural makeup. I think it's interesting politically. It plays a fascinating role globally politically. It has good links. It's more sort of Western aligned, and I'm sure we'll talk about Western Sahara. But I think as a place to go, it just offers so much richness culturally, and it's a wonderful, wonderful food, beautiful markets, interesting people, and I think as a place to study or be interested in, it's fascinating. And I think my time there as a diplomat was incredibly interesting, seeing how a constitutional monarchy sees itself in the region, how it sees itself relative to other powers, and some of its priorities, foreign policy and domestic policy.
Tell us about that monarchy. I mean, hybrid regime, is that a fair phrase?
Yeah, so constitutional monarchy officially, sort of parliamentary, officially the government is the executive, but in reality, it's the Maghzen, which is this sort of council around the king that drives politics. And my engagement with Moroccan government, a lot comes from the king. It's incredibly hierarchical. It's very bureaucratic. That's a legacy of sort of, the worst bits of French bureaucracy and probably Arabic pride. So it wasn't always the easiest place to work. But yes, the monarchy really drives everything, and that sense of you don't really get an idea of how powerful it is until you start working with Moroccan counterparts.
And where are they on radical Islam within society?
Yeah, again, so some of the work I was doing there touched on Islamism and terrorism and counterterrorism stuff, and working with Moroccan partners was really interesting because the mood music in the West is, particularly on the sort of intelligence and security side, is look, actually, our big problem now is hostile state actors. It's Russia, it's China, it's Iran. We sort of see Islamism as yesterday's problem, and the Moroccans would basically be telling you, look, that is a really incorrect reading of the situation because Islamist groups still have reach. There's a lot of festering wounds in the Middle East that drive the recruitment of Islamists, and if you take your eye off that ball, it will come and bite you. So a lot of the conversations we were having with our Moroccan partners was actually them trying to get us to realize this hasn't gone away. This problem is still here. There are still loads of Moroccan Islamists who are in those camps in northern Syria. Al-Maghrebi, who is number two in Al-Qaeda, is a Moroccan guy. So they are worried about it, but mostly what drives that concern is tourism, because tourism is such a huge part of their economy. And if there is an Islamist attack, and let's say Foreign Office or whoever it is downgrades their advice to tourists, so only go there for essential, that has a real world impact on Morocco's economy. So a big driver of that was, we have to stay open for business, and we can't take our eye off this ball.
And culturally, tell us about the two identities, the African identity and the Arab identity.
Yeah, I mean that is it's something that during my time there you never quite get to the bottom of, and it's a little bit like, sort of a member of the Haqqani network telling you that they are a proud Taliban person, and then the next day telling you that they're a proud Haqqani. There is a duality there, and there is probably a little bit of I wouldn't say racism, but there's a sense of superiority that these sort of northern African Arabs have over the sophistication of their culture, potentially, because of the French influence, that is different to the way they would see their Senegalese or, African brethren. So that definitely is a factor in the identity. Probably a bit in the identity is the Berber identity. Now you have a tension between sort of French, Arabic, and Berber. I mean, French is less now, but Arabic and Berber. I think the Arabic Islamist, or Islamic rather, identity is stronger than the Berber one, purely because the cities have more Arabs in them related to the Berbers who are usually in the countryside. So that's what's driven that. But I think increasingly you're seeing sort of Berber groups pushing for more recognition. So, there was a big thing a couple of years ago when on the signs of all the roads, maybe it was more than a couple of years ago, that was in Tashahit, they were written in Berber as well as in Arabic and English. So this is just an indication that the Berber communities are striving for more recognition and role in the political life of Morocco.
So it's like Wales, where we have similar arrangements
Exactly.
for the Welsh language. And just on the Western Sahara, I mean, I remember, the World Service 20 years ago. I think we did that conflict about every week, and I mean, it must be about 3-4 years since we've done it, I think. Why has that fallen off the agenda? What's going on?
So what's going on? I think in terms of, I mean, the conflict remains frozen. There's obviously Polisario activity, and the Moroccans are very, very, very nervous about the Western Sahara issue and the role of Polisario people or fighters, whatever you want to call them, sympathizers, is uppermost in the Moroccan mind. When I was in post, a Polisario official or fighter or sympathizer, a senior Polisario official, used an alias to travel into Spain to seek treatment. And the Moroccan government went absolutely bonkers, and released basically the island, and from Morocco into Ceuta, the Spanish enclave, they released 2,000 Moroccan refugees. They just said, right, go and have a go. And every single person I spoke to in Morocco about, and every single person, from my Arabic teacher to the Moroccan staff at the embassy, everyone would say this is an absolute disgrace. This is an absolute disgrace. But I think where we are geopolitically, it looks like Morocco is winning the debate on that. Spain has come closer to the Moroccan position, which was unthinkable 5 years ago. America is very close to the Moroccan position. The UK looks like it's going that way if it hasn't gone that way already. So sort of Morocco is winning the geopolitical hearts and minds, and they put huge amounts of money and time into lobbying Western countries to recognize the Morocco position on Western Sahara, which is their bit of the land.
Okay, well, that shows us. Now, just tell us, if people go there, what sort of access what sort of place is it? Can you get lots of access there? Do people talk? Are they all too nervous to express themselves? How good a place is it to be a political tourist?
So I think it is a fascinating place, and the tour will hopefully touch on some of the drivers of Morocco's economy, which is kind of clothes factories in Rabat that basically make all the clothes that you buy in pretty much every shop in the UK, the ones that aren't made in China. So from that perspective, you get a really good insight into Morocco's economy. Obviously, Morocco's culture, the tourism elements of it, the sort of physical beauty of the country and its architecture, and that sort of visible aesthetic of Morocco, very accessible and very much on display. To talk to someone, whether they like the monarchy or not, or whether they like the king, you might get a guarded response to that. You might get a guarded response on sort of plurality of religions. It's not a particularly good place to be if you are a Christian. It's not a terrible place to be if you're a Christian, but it's not a particularly good place. If you want to be a Moroccan and you want to convert to Christianity, that's not a good thing to do. So everyone is incredibly, on the surface at least, supportive of the monarchy. The king is sort of has his own foibles, but it's not a closed off state. It's not like some states. You could get a relatively frank conversation, but there will be a degree of guardedness about saying anything critical of the king and the ruling family.
Which makes it all the more interesting as you
Exactly.
try to work out what's going on. So, look, I think we'll wrap it up there. Is there any more questions? Last chance, either on the Iran situation and the whole Middle East generally, or on Morocco in particular. And in the absence of any digital hands being raised or comments being made in the various boxes, I will say thank you very much to Charlie Gammell. That was a very rapid, highly articulate, obviously, and very clear tour of a lot of Middle Eastern politics. So thank you very much. And that's it for this podcast broadcast from Political Tours.